Don't punish me with brutality. Talk to me so you can see what's going on. What's going on?
It is my duty to introduce our invited preacher for the evening. But he has not arrived. I'm going to begin some introductory remarks, leaning on the Lord, trusting in God's providence to deliver. Amen. You can't hear me? Can you hear now? Is that better? At the 221st General Assembly, a document was presented to the General Assembly titled The Gospel from Detroit. And it is the Gospel from Detroit that has set this presbytery upon a path, upon a journey that for the past 2 years, this year included, has included our adoption of a theme to guide us through each presbytery meeting. And this year's theme is the promotion of social righteousness. But to go back to the spirit of the document called The Gospel from Detroit, one of the intentions of that document was to give an overview of the development of the Presbyterian Church USA in general and the Presbytery of Detroit in particular within urban bounds, within inner city regions, within demographics of population that were predominantly non-white, and also of a more economically challenged class strata. That history, that overview, portrayed the Presbytery of Detroit in a particular light that showed a continual decline of the presence of Presbyterian churches in the city of Detroit. As the need rose, the presence of the Presbyterian church diminished in the city regions of Detroit. I find that interesting as we stand here today as we await prayerfully Reverend Wendell Anthony's arrival. I find it interesting because as we gather to remember the rebellion of 1967, I find it interesting that when the rebellion began, the church that was closest to the epicenter of the rebellion was St. Mark's Presbyterian Church. There was only a children's playground that separated St. Mark's from the quote-unquote blind pig where the rebellion began. St. Mark's is an interesting church, has interesting history. In 1950, it was chartered by the, the United Presbyterian denomination. It was chartered in 1950, and the organizing pastor then was a man by the name of Albert Clegg. Albert Clegg left St. Mark's and subsequently formed a cornerstone church in the annals of the religious history of America, especially within black theology. Albert Clegg formed the Shrine of the Black Madonna. Albert Clegg's tenure as the pastor of St. Mark's was followed by a man by the name of James Wadsworth Jr. James Wadsworth Jr. subsequently left St. Mark's and formed Fellowship Chapel. Upon the death of James Wadsworth Jr., Fellowship Chapel called the Reverend Dr. Wendell Anthony as the pastor. Interesting path of history that unites Fellowship Chapel under the leadership, the pastorate of the Reverend Dr. Wendell Anthony, with the history of the Presbyterian Church and the Presbytery of Detroit. St. Mark's is no longer, as is the case for so many of our Presbyterian churches in the city of Detroit. So as we remember 1967, perhaps Reverend Dr. Anthony will come through the door. Perhaps for some reason he may not. But as we are gathered here today to remember a seminal event in the history of America 50 years ago, the question has to be considered. What is the church's posture in demographics of socially challenged and disenfranchised people, when the social and political structures of the country seem to be removing more and more of the gains that came through the movement for social transformation through the 50s and the 60s? What is the church's posture and position in cities such as Detroit, where the percentages of people living below the poverty line have increased over the course of the past 50 years? School systems have shut down. Opportunities for quote-unquote advancement have diminished for so many of our people in these city regions. Where is the hope? Where is the voice? Where is the prophetic voice that speaks out against the movement of a society that declares it wants to be great again? The question has to be asked, was the society ever great in the first place? How can a society be great if it is founded upon principles that declares that people of native origin and people of African origin are not considered fully human? The founding language of America says, "We the people." Clearly, black people were not a part of the equation. We the people. Clearly, people of the First Nation were not a part of the equation. This is the nation that we declare we want to make great again. This is the arrogance of America, drunk on the wine of the world. Upward mobility, white privilege, America, the beautiful. 1967, the landscape of Detroit was scarred by fire. Many people ask the question, since I don't see my brother walking through the door, then I'm just going to take the liberty and just share a few more things, and then I'll get out of the way. Many people ask the question, what sense does it make for people to burn their own neighborhoods, burn the businesses, burn structures that provide social, cultural, recreational opportunities? What sense does that make? Is that an act of barbarianism? Is that an act of insanity. There's a man named Moses who once upon a time saw a fire. The fire was for a purpose to gain Moses' attention, because God wanted to have a conversation with Moses. As we remember 1967, I call that incident to you because God is trying to have a conversation with America. It is not insane for people to start fires. It is insane to turn away from the fire and not to hearken to the invitation to have a conversation with God. God is trying to have a conversation with the Presbytery of Detroit as we remember 1967. And I think I see my brother walking through the door. So I'm going to get out of the way. I'm just going to ask my brother to keep on walking. Just follow the sound, Wendell. Reverend Dr. Wendell Anthony is the pastor of Fellowship Chapel, and I sort of set the stage by tracing its formation back to the leadership of James Wadsworth Jr. He is also the president of the Detroit chapter of the NAACP. He has a very extensive biography that is always provided by Fellowship Chapel and is accessible online. All you have to do is pull up his name. But he is a gift to the city, a gift to the nation. He is a friend of mine, and he is a friend of God's. I'm glad you made it, my brother. And we're just going to call you up and put you on the spot right now. And you might get in trouble with others, but I'll just say let the Spirit have its way, Wendell. This is not a foreign creature to you.
Let me say good afternoon to everybody, and to thank Kevin and you all for inviting me to be a part of your session today. I really just came to be with you and to talk with you, and Kevin said if you could talk about what you have on your screen and where we are now, and do it in 20 minutes. But remember my days in the Presbyterian Church, I do know 10 to 12 to 15 is always good relative to that. And we appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to thank you for having me, and certainly on behalf of Fellowship Chapel United Church of Christ, which is not far from here on West Outer Drive. I'm sure you've seen it, and the Detroit NAACP. I just want to thank you for taking a moment and to share with a look back to go forward. These are very critical times, and I think most of us understand where we are. And if we just took a word of scripture for such a time as this, it would still be rooted in something that makes it real simple. Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. Let the church say amen. That's very basic, that's very fundamental, and it should not elicit or solicit any kind of confusion. And so as we sit and stand and come today in the city of Detroit, which is a city that reflects historically and even currently, those issues and those struggles that did in fact and still do in fact require justice and not just us. If we go back for just a few years, if we go back 50 years ago, if you were in Detroit, if you were anywhere in the country, it was a time of great tension and disturbance. It was a time when our churches were being challenged by the lack of justice and equity around the nation. The struggle for human rights and civil rights was brought into our living rooms, live and in living color every day on the 4 and 5 o'clock news. I think it was 4 and 5 o'clock back then. 4 and 5 o'clock news. Walter Cronkite, Good Night David, Good Night Chet. You remember those cats. They were on the sets every day. And we saw the work of Dr. King, which was permeating our nation. Vietnam was challenging us. Students were marching, and the disenchantment was rampant in our nation. And you had the reality of where is the church in all of this? Where is the Word of God and the power of God in all of this? And Dr. King kind of manifested that within the civil rights movement, particularly as it relates to down south and to parts of the Midwest and the North. As a matter of fact, in '63, you recall Dr. King came to Detroit and did his first I Have a Dream speech. Some of you may have participated in that in downtown Detroit. Historically, the NAACP did not support that march and that struggle because they felt that Dr. King would come and take all the resources, and that he was too militant, and that he was not, this was not a part of what we should be doing. And so, matter of fact, they did not support it. It was supported by Reverend Dr. C.L. Franklin, James Del Rio, Albert Clegg, UAW, and others, Tony Brown, who organized, and they worked together, raised money, brought Dr. King up here, had the march, which was a prelude to Washington in August of that same year, and the beat goes on. And so the struggle continued, and the church was being challenged. Matter of fact, a lot of churches would not allow Dr. King to be in their churches. Now every church got a picture of Dr. King. Every city has Martin Luther King Boulevard. Every school has a Martin Luther King scholarship and Martin Luther King Way and all that. And if you ask anybody today, everybody marched with him and everybody supported him. But we know hindsight is always better than foresight. And so we still love everybody anyway. But more than just having a dream on the mountaintop, because as long as you leave Dr. King on the top of the mountain dreaming, you don't have to have him down in the valley working. And so Dr. King was much more than a dream. Dr. King was why we can't wait. Dr. King was chaos or community. Where do we go from here? Dr. King was on the Jericho Road. Dr. King was a knock at midnight. Dr. King was more than just a word to titillate your fancies and to make you feel good about some altruistic, philanthropic kind of notions that we might have as a church community, but the church should be engaged in the struggle for justice of its people. And so you come to a city like Detroit, and Motown, home of Motown, the automobile capital of the world, and the songs that were being sung back in those days, the music that was being sung, expressed the concerns, even if the church did not express those concerns, which is why scriptures teach us if we don't preach the gospel, even the very rocks will cry out. If we don't do what we're supposed to be doing, even our young people, even those disenfranchised folk who are not within the church body, will speak out, sing out, preach out, teach out, write out, draw out, run out. They will be engaged in all those things that enable the people of God to reflect who and what God's people would do. And so leading up to '67 in Detroit, was all the things that was happening in the country. You had the advent of cities that did not have representation of all of its people. In Detroit, when you go back and you look at what precipitated the rebellion here, and a lot of folk now are having rebellion celebrations and commemorations. We don't celebrate the fact that over 1,189 folk were in fact injured. We don't celebrate the fact that over 4,000 people were arrested. We don't celebrate the fact that 43 people were killed, and the youngest arrested was 4 and the oldest was 82. We don't celebrate the fact that there was $45 to $65 million in buildings and stores and businesses that were burned or that were decimated during that process. We don't celebrate that. We commemorate what occurred there some 50 years ago, which precipitated the occurrence. What occurred? If you go back and if you read the materials that was being published and what Sidney Fine from the University of Michigan wrote as a result of the study, there were 2 or 3 key issues that precipitated what happened in the city of Detroit. Detroit is being called out because of the size and the scope and the caliber of what happened here in this city. There's even a movie that's getting ready to come up. Now, you may have seen some of the commercials, Detroit, 67, going back to visit what happened then leading up to now. I've done several interviews, and people are coming from various places across the country to talk about Detroit then versus Detroit now and the differences in what we're saying. But Sidney Fine wrote, and we understood, the number one reason for the rebellion was the kind of hard-headedness and hard-handedness that the police department was doing. The police department was not representative of the community. There were no African Americans within the department. There were no officers in the department. There was no police commission. There was no police review board. The fire department was essentially of the same kind of caliber. The Common Council, wasn't called the City Council then, it was called the Common Council, only had one member. That was Nicholas Hood. And the police department was viewed as an army of occupation. The educational system was viewed as being less than or mediocre and not supporting with the kind of quality that the community needed to have for its children. That merchants were disrespectful and they were not having the kind of materials and the kind of produce in their stores that folk who lived on Linwood, Dexter and Mack and Bewick and Joy Road and Finco and Outer Drive. Well, a whole lot of us wasn't over here on Outer Drive at that time. Many of you were, but we were just ready to get ready to move in this area. We were on the other side. We wasn't always on this side. And so a lot of the folk who lived in those communities were not able to deal with that. 12th Street, now Rosa Parks Boulevard, was on and popping in terms of the kind of activity and business and fellowship and social activity that was occurring. And it was within that kind of experience that this thing began to explode and began to emerge. So you had a lack of housing that was attributable as one of the factors that led to what was being involved within the scope of the rebellion that would occur. And then within that maze, you had folk in church denominations who were saying that the church is not on its job, it's not doing what it needs to do. It is ignoring the social pain of what's happening in our communities. Dr. King even talked about that any religion that seeks to damn the soul and to damn those individuals that are engaged in trying to correct situations without damning the conditions that create the situations are basically a dry, dead, do-nothing religion in search of new blood. Dr. King articulated that. Dr. King talked about as we go older and we come into new time periods and we look towards the future, we will not be judged by the voices and the loudness of the bad people. We'll be judged by the silence and the neglect of the good people. And we find ourselves at this moment here again. And so within that situation, you had emerging the Coalition of Black Church Unions, You had the Shrine of the Black Madonna emerging as an institution that began to see itself differently. And in '67, you saw the birth and the introduction of the Black Madonna at the Shrine of the Black Madonna. At that time, it was a congregational church under Reverend Clay, and they went through a change, and it began to be something that set as a model for the rest of the country. And you remember that at Sacred Heart, on the day after the rebellion began, when they had the unveiling in March, rather, of the Black Madonna, there was a painting of the face of Christ right there at Chicago and Linwood. And the church has continued to paint that face black, reflecting the community since that very day. But that was not unusual, because if you go around the world, you'll see Black Madonnas all through Europe and in Russia and in Asia. And so it is not unusual. It was unusual for us because we'd never seen it. So I'm simply saying that out of that experience emerged the church, and its activists and its social concerns for justice was even heightened at that time, particularly with Vietnam, particularly with all the things that was going on in our cities. There was at least 125 cities across this country that went into flames, not just Detroit. Detroit was the biggest, but it was about 125 cities. And following all of that, following the death of Dr. King in '68, following the introduction and the passing of fair housing laws and the Voting Rights Act, and all the things that came out of Lyndon Baines Johnson and that crew, and Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy and all those individuals, and the church, Conyers, and so many others who helped. Fannie Lou Hamer, sharecropper, daughter with among some 22 children, pushing for voting and pushing for the church and for the church to be engaged. And we come to Detroit and we find our church in this city. When I say our church, I'm talking about the church, not any particular church, but our church being challenged to address those concerns. And out of those concerns, we began to see changes emanating, beginning to evolve. Folk beginning to run for political office. Folk beginning to run for mayor. Folk beginning to run for city council. Folk beginning to run for board of education. Folk demanding more equity on the police department, on the fire department. Folk demanding economic access. And here we are in 2017. We have a majority African American city council. We've had 5 black mayors. We have a African-American Wayne County prosecutor, African-American Wayne County executive. We have a board of education replete with African-Americans. We have a fire department that is now heavily integrated. We have all those things versus what we did not have in 1967. And no, because we have that, that does not mean we've crossed the Jordan. What that means is that, and I tell folk this every time, because some folks say, ain't nothing happened. That's not true. Because all I got to do is point to the evidence. Some things have happened. And then I have people who say that, well, ain't enough happened. That is true. Because once we begin to accept and to understand that we've done enough, then we don't try anymore. And now we find ourselves as a church, as a faith-based community, facing the same question. What does the Lord require of us? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. And being in the age of Trump, we find ourselves with Jeff Sessions at the head of the Department of Justice, pulling back the reforms that police departments have made over the last several years, pulling back the concern that communities and police departments have worked out together, following Ferguson, following Baltimore, following Chicago, not intervening into issues involving voting rights and voter protection and backing away. We find ourselves in the era of Betsy DeVos, who's pulling back from education, who is reducing the budget of education in favor of public education, in favor of more charters and more vouchers. And yeah, that's all right, but America was built on public education. Ex-slaves and poor white folk built the public educational system. We didn't have schools that were eminent and were predominant in our churches, and all of them in the basements and in the sanctuaries and in the attics when we did not have schools. And for someone to suggest that black colleges were the first schools of choice reflects the ignorance historically and academically of what they were. Black colleges didn't have no choice. That's why they were formed. Booker T. Washington would not have chosen and elected to go in the backwoods and to build Tuskegee. He had no choice. Mary McLeod Bethune would not have built Bethune-Cookman on top of a trash heap in Florida. She had no choice. We didn't choose to emanate and to start Spelman and Fisk and all those universities from the basement of churches and from the homes of individuals. We had no choice. So when you say they were the first schools of choice, how ignorant that happens to be. You're ignorant of history and the struggle that has been waged. We now find ourselves at a point where national health care for all of America's sons and daughters is being threatened by people who got health care forever and a day. As a congressman, as a senator, I'm good to go for the rest of my life. Health care ain't no issue for me. And so how dare you take it from me and from mine? And yet the church, in many cases, 81% of the evangelical Christian community supported this guy. 81% Christians put him in the White House. What does the Lord require of us when he's already said he ain't about justice, when he's about building walls and not building bridges, when he's about disrespecting women and the handicapped and those challenged by mental illness? What does the Lord require of thee? How can you have him at your Christian convocation when everything that he's doing is against Christianity? And then one poses the question, if that had been Barack Obama, I don't even have to go no further. First of all, he would never have been elected. When he walked off the bus and sang "What I Do to Women," that would have killed him right there, because y'all wouldn't have voted for him. And some wouldn't vote for him anyway. Not based upon his lack of ability, but because we can't get beyond this factor. This is not the way America is supposed to be. And if we're honest, part of the reason Trump is in office is because of the backlash against 8 years of Barack Obama. This black man, this black wife, 2 black daughters, a black grandmama, a black dog in the White House. That just ain't supposed to go. That is just not supposed to go. That's not the way the doctor ordered it. And if we are honest, we know it's the truth. And yet, look what we got now. Disrespected by the nations of the world. Can't go to London, England. won't stand up for the allies, children more corrupt along with him than anybody in American history. All kind of deals at our expense. And so where does the church stand in all of this? Where are we on voter suppression and protection? Where are we on health care? Where are we on bringing everybody to the table? Where are we on making certain we don't have two Detroits but one city? See, downtown is going to be fine. A lot of stuff going on downtown. I ain't mad about that. And I tell people all the time, don't move, just improve right where you are. You cannot have two Detroits. You can't have a downtown Detroit and a midtown Detroit and then out here in the neighborhood. That's why I claim all of this. I ain't giving up nothing. I ain't going nowhere. All of this is mine. Downtown is mine, midtown is mine, and the neighborhoods is mine. I'm a Detroiter. My taxes covers all of that. That's why when I go into the restaurant, I don't take the first seat they give me. No, I don't want that one. I want that one over there. I just want to feel like I'm special. Amen? I just want to feel like I'm important to the process. And I'm simply saying that the church, we need you more now than ever before. Now is not the time for the church to step back. Now's the time for the church to step up. I know we get tired. As I look in this room, I know some of y'all have been on the struggle for a long time. You've been fighting some of these battles longer than I have. And I thought I was getting ready to lead the NAACP, but Lord have mercy, when this guy got in, it's like, no, you can't go nowhere right now. Because he has changed. He has changed some of our retirement programs. Because the struggle is not yet over. And it's really not over until we lay prostrate. And somebody's up here preaching your eulogy. And the question becomes, are you going to make it difficult for the preacher? Does he or she have to be creative? The most difficult job for any preacher is to have to stand up before the people and to talk about somebody that ain't never done nothing in their life and to make up stuff. I've never been to a funeral where the preacher preached a person into hell. They always preach them into heaven. Amen. Anybody, come on now, you know. You ain't never been to a funeral where the guy preached a person into hell. They always, even they can be the worst kind of person, but some kind of way, the preacher's gonna find something good to say something about the person. Well, there was this one particular individual, and he was so mean and so disreputable. But he died, as we all do. And so the preacher was solicited to do his eulogy, and he was wrestling with what can I say about this brother, because I know he ain't never done nothing to help nobody. He been terrible all his life, and I got to get in front of the church and talk about him. And so he thought, and the day came for the funeral, and so when he got time to do the eulogy, as he was making his comments, he said, well, I know that we're all concerned about this brother. And the best thing that I can say to him was that on Saturdays, he was not that bad. On Saturdays, he was not that bad. If that's what's on your marker, when the Lord has already laid out a blueprint for what we need to be about, for what the church needs to be about, then we need to rethink who and what we are. And so as I come today just to say a word about justice and just to say a word about what the Lord requires, the Lord is still requiring the same thing today that he required in the day of Micah, to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. And though we've done it unto the least of these, we've done it unto me. See, when you talk about I was sick and you came to see me, That's national health care. When you talk about I was in prison and you came to visit me, that's the piece on the prison industrial complex and what we need to deal with. When we talk about I was a stranger and you took me in, that's your immigration program. That's your national executive orders. You want to ban folk coming in the country. If Jesus had been coming, if they had had an executive order on Jesus before Moses, before Joseph and Mary were able to get in to the land, and sorry, you can't come in here because we got an executive order. If Jesus were coming into America now, and the president's travel ban was instituted, he couldn't get into the country just to save us from ourselves. And so we have blueprints, brothers and sisters. The church is needed now more than ever before. Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, AMEs, United Church of Christ, Church of God in Christ, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, atheists, all of us can get a piece of this. I always tell people that there's enough hell burning around in our country for everybody to get their own individual bucket and decide what fire they want to put out. Now, if you got a problem with this denomination, hook up with another denomination. If you don't like what that group is doing, then hook up with another group. If you can't deal with the schools, then deal with your block. If you can't deal with your block, then deal with your family. If you can't deal with your family, then deal with yourself. Now, if you ain't dealing with nobody, then you just simply blowing smoke, and you need to shut up, sit down, step back, and let somebody else step up that's trying to do something to effectuate some change in our community. But there's something for everyone to get engaged. And so as I come by to say hi to you all, and to say that from this young man who started off at the St. Mark's Presbyterian Church, pastored by the Reverend James E. Wadsworth Jr. years ago, and then working as a community outreach director of the Broad Street United Presbyterian Church under Reverend Dr. Lawrence T. Glenn years ago. I ain't forgot where I came from. I ain't forgot my roots. I ain't forgot my growth, because I always understand that you cannot love the tree and hate the roots. You got to deal with both of them. And so here it is. Let's go out and produce some fruit. Thank you for listening. Did I go too long?
We're going to take a moment to have some open response time. I'm going to first call Sister Kalisha Davis to the mic. Kalisha is the Director of Community Outreach and Engagement and Detroit Revitalization Fellow for the Detroit Historical Society. What we'd like to do is to get an overview of some of the things that are brewing within the city in the spirit of '67. And so after Kalisha comes forward and gives us some insights into her presence and the work that she's engaged with, we're going to hear from Elder Dr. Harold Ellis from St. John's, who is the former moderator of the Presbytery of Detroit. Let the church say amen.
Good afternoon. It's my sincere pleasure to be here with all of you today. And as Reverend Kevin said, my name is Kalisha Davis. I'm the Director of Community Outreach and Engagement. And on behalf of our Executive Director, Robert Burry, our Board of Trustees, and our amazing team, I bring you special greetings from the Detroit Historical Society. I also bring you greetings as a member of Gracious Savior Lutheran Church, the small but mighty congregation that actively serves the community just a mile away from this very location. I want to thank the Presbytery of Detroit for having me here today. Many thanks to Pastor Kevin Johnson for extending this special invitation. And thank you to Reverend Wendell Anthony for your passionate and informative points of reflection this afternoon. Before I respond to Reverend Anthony's sermon, please allow me to give you a bit of context for what I do and how it relates to this conversation. Since May of 2015, the Detroit Historical Society has embarked on a path to develop and convene the Detroit 67 Project, a multi-year, multifaceted community engagement initiative designed to commemorate the 50th anniversary of July 1967 here in Detroit. As an organization with a distinct mission to tell Detroit stories and why they matter, we are realizing the vision for this massive endeavor through the first ever oral history archive dedicated to documenting the experiences of residents who lived through those tumultuous days of civil unrest. A state-of-the-art exhibition set to open at the Detroit Historical Museum on June 24th, 2017. A comprehensive book examining 300 years of the city's history, and a host of community partners totaling more than 100 organizations, all with a vested interest in this endeavor to create a variety of community and cultural events, projects, and programs that will reach thousands of people in the metropolitan area through summer 2018. This project spans 150 years, beginning around 1863 with the first race riot that took place in the city of Detroit, up to 1943, through 1967 to present day, with our examination of what this city can potentially become 50 years forward. I joined the organization in September 2015 as a Detroit Revitalization Fellow and was charged with the task of not only nurturing and formalizing, but also conceptualizing and implementing community partnerships and the resulting programs with individuals and organizations throughout the city. After more than 15 years away from Detroit, pursuing a career in public service in localities including Washington, D.C., New York, and the Bay Area, it has been the most tremendous blessing and honor to finally come home, to pour my time, talent, and energies into the city that I've always loved and that laid a foundation for service and community throughout my formative years. Now, I'm pretty sure Reverend Anthony wouldn't remember this or wouldn't be aware, but many years ago, I was a Girl Scout member of Troop 1600 at Fellowship Chapel. And one of the most profound memories that I'll ever have in serving the community is the troop's participation in the anti-apartheid movement in the late 80s. Not only did we collect keys as a symbol advocating for the freedom of the children being jailed in South African prisons, but we sold enough cookies and raised enough money to go to our nation's capital, deliver those keys to the South African embassy, marching and proudly singing the South African national anthem, which had been taught to us by our troop leaders along the way. Afterwards, we met with Congressman John Conyers, who awarded us with a special certificate recognizing our efforts in his private office on Capitol Hill. Where else but in Detroit would a 12-year-old girl have an experience like that one? This is one of many experiences that have had an imprint on my life and taught me that I had the power and the will to make a difference. Detroit is and always will be a special place. This is the right time to have this kind of conversation in our community. I didn't grow up in 1967, but grew up in the decades that followed. I knew that it was relevant. That's the word that comes up again and again in the courageous conversations that we've had with people from all walks of life and all ages across the city. Relevance. What happened in the summer of 1967 in Detroit was unfortunately a precursor to decades of challenges that we faced as a country since that time, as recently as the summer of 2015 in Ferguson, Missouri, the summer of 2015 in Waller County, Texas, and the summer of 2016 in St. Anthony, Minnesota, just to name a few. There were several things that resonated with me regarding Reverend Anthony's sermon. The first was one of his first statements, which was to walk humbly with our God. This kind of service requires all of us to challenge ourselves, to dig deep, and to begin to have an openness and a willingness to talk with people that look different from us and think differently from us. What also resonated was that this is not a celebration, but this is a commemoration driven by our community, and we're so pleased to have so many people at the table with us to accomplish this work. The last was a statement that he said that what does the Lord require of us? We have the ability collectively to take steps to promote change in our community on a daily basis. In 1967, 43 lives were lost. Families lost their homes and were immediately displaced. Business owners lost their livelihoods. 12th Street, a thriving community, was completely devastated. But in the midst of all of those things, what I've learned is that there was a thread of collective determination to address the needs of the people least served and to create opportunities for generations to come. Some efforts were led by people and organizations that we may never be able to recognize for their efforts. And some were very familiar and are still serving, including the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center, Operation Get Down, Father Cunningham and Eleanor Jositis, Michigan Roundtable for Diversity and Inclusion, New Detroit, and Grace Episcopal Church that's located right in the heart of the 12th Street community to this day and is celebrating 100 years of service. They faced adversity and found ways to build community in spite of it. Our collective voice, presence, and power are what will make all the difference for our community as a whole. This is the right time, the right city, and the right opportunity. If any of what I've said resonates with you today, I want to invite you to join the society and hundreds of others in this commemoration. One particular effort that I want to draw your attention to is our interfaith initiative that launched last week called Weekend of Prayer, The Courage to Love, designed for all faith communities in the metro area to opt in to a series of activities that encourage unity and community-driven reflection using July 67 as the catalyst for dialogue. As a Christian, it was important for me to launch this effort, and with the support of people such as Pastor Georgia Hill at Plymouth United Church of Christ, Pastor Manisha Dosert at Christ Church Cranbrook, and Arlene Frank, Executive Director at Isaac Agree Downtown Synagogue, I'm pleased to invite you to learn more. There is an invitation letter and flyers on the back tables, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Detroit 67 Project gives us the opportunity to look back for the purposes of moving our community forward, and we hope that you will join us. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your consideration today. God bless you and God bless our city, and I hope that I can connect with you again soon.
Good afternoon, my brothers and sisters. It's good to see all of you again. Kevin, was this a setup? After listening to Ms. Davis and Wendell Anthony, then you asked me to come and say a few words, but I'm not going to use all of the 45 minutes you promised me I had to speak, because as a former moderator, I know what time is, and actually I can't say too much. I had things to tell you, but Wendell, who I've known for about 40 years, and Ms. Davis, a wonderful example of the young people, I can't really add to that. But I want to say about 3 minutes is that I can remember back in 1967, July 23rd. In fact, I still have, I think, some underwear that I'm still wearing from back then, but it really hasn't been that long, and I can tell most of you weren't even born then. But that day, that Sunday, I went to Pine Knob with my future wife to see the Righteous Brothers. And that morning, the news indicated there was some trouble on 12th and Claremont. And my father was a barber, and his brothers were barbers too, and they had two barber shops on the 12th and the Claremont area. And during the insurrection, both of those were burned down. But my father said, go ahead to the concert. And I was 21 at the time, roughly finished college. I had all the enthusiasm. I wanted to do great things, which I didn't. But it was a good life. And after the show, I was driving back from Pine Knobs, and we heard the reports. And I called on the way back, and my dad said, son, don't come home. And we were living in the Linwood, Livernois, Puritan area, still a decent neighborhood, but I can remember the 4 days during the insurrection where there seemed like 50 to 20,000 officers, the paratroopers, the National Guard going through the neighborhood. It was horrendous. Truthfully, I don't think things are better today than they were back in 1967. You look at our educational system, you look at the young men who are incarcerated, but more important, look at our family structure. And as Reverend Anthony said, we can point with pride to perhaps to Michael Jordan, the Obamas, and others, but too many in our community are still suffering. So the question is, what are we going to do as Christians? What am I going to do? So, in closing, and Kevin, I did prepare about 30 minutes, and two things I want to ask you to do. One is to Google Detroit 1967 riots. And I lived through it. And you hear these stories that people were burning their buildings down, and Reverend Anthony alluded to that too, but in preparing for today, I learned that the first looter wasn't a black or Afro-American, but it was a white citizen. I mean, that doesn't make it any better, but it just shows that your perception of things can be wrong. And also, I have hope for our city, for our great nation, but it ain't going to happen unless we commit ourselves to change. And I really don't see that. So, hopefully we can support our families. And, I talk to Al all the time about going into the communities, and it's important to go to the communities. That's where we're needed, but we have to support our families. We support our families, support our youth, our communities will be better. So anyway, I know enough as being your moderator, know when to sit down, and I know enough being a Christian and a Presbyterian to say that people are hungry in front of me. So as I say, this is all, folks. But I said, Google the riot, and also Google what's going on. It's a record written in 1971 by Marvin Gaye, and he expressed in What's Going On my feelings of 1967. So anyway, thank you for listening to me, and Kevin, that's it for me.
Okay. All right. I wasn't living in Detroit in 1967, but I was alive in 1967. My city didn't burn until '68. But as I said in the beginning, I watched my city burn from a rooftop, and I asked the Lord a question. D.C., the nation's capital, and the nation's capital burned. And I stood and I saw the flames rise above the tree level of the nation's capital. And I saw the smoke coming up from the downtown area. And I asked the Lord a question. I said, God, what could make people so angry? That was Kevin Johnson's burning bush moment. Because I had a conversation with God. And God said it had to do with race. And God said, in order for you to find out that the source of that anger, you've got to go into a strange land. You've got to leave the land of your comfort, your father's land, your mother's land. I had to leave black America, and I had to come to white America. The question for white America is, when are you going to come to black America? When are you going to really humble yourself and come to black America and do justice by black America? There's another landmark that Detroit is very well known for, and it took place in 1969. So we're coming up on that anniversary in a couple of years. In 1969, the Black Economic Development Conference Convention met in the city of Detroit, and a black manifesto was drafted. And that black manifesto was sent to the white churches and the white synagogues of America. And that manifesto demanded $500 million of reparation for slavery from the white churches and the white synagogues of America to be given to black people, black Americans. Jews received reparation because of the Holocaust, World War II. Various tribes of the indigenous people of this nation have received reparations, land and money, because of the atrocities of the genocide against the native people of America. And black people have received 45. That's what we got. Until the philosophy that holds one race superior to another has finally and permanently been abandoned, abolished, utterly destroyed. Until then, there will be war. There will be fires. There will be rebellions. Because this country is not great. It can be if we so choose to go down that path. Please remember to make your comments available and pass them down to the center aisle. We will collect them on our way out. I'm going to ask Fran that as she gives us our closing prayer, that she also ask a blessing. Where's Fran? Ask a blessing upon the food. I'll just remind you of the incident that took place at LeBron James' home in California. No matter how high your star can rise in this country, no matter how much money you make, how good you can play ball, even how great you can govern, in this country, you are still nothing more than and nothing less than a black man. 50 years since '67, we've still got a long way to go. And my narrative is that as an urban pastor in the city of Detroit that tries to deal with the brokenness of this city, I shudder to think what the next rebellion is going to look like because of the proliferation of firearms in the hands of everyday citizens like you and me, especially in the hands of the underclass. who all they could do last time around was throw bricks and throw bottles. The next time around, they're going to be shooting AKs and MRs, and it's going to be war. Where's the church? Is the church ready to do justice? Is the church ready to love mercy? And is the church ready to truly walk humbly with our God? Please, please look on the resource papers table before you leave on your way out. The weekend of prayer. This is our offering to the presbytery to engage in further action on the issue of race in general, and in particular, as we move towards the remembrance of 1967. Take this to your congregations, take this to your communities, and use this as a guide about how we move forward into truly making America great.